Well, it's okay. All right. All right, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. And if we have some additional folks coming in, that's perfectly fine. And if you have any questions, it's fine to unmute yourselves and ask a question. Or if you'd like to type it in the chat box, I'm going to try to monitor that as well. So today we're going to be talking about suicide prevention. And September is Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. So these subjects coincide well together for September. So in every presentation that we do, we talk a little bit about who Alliance is. And we are the local MCO, or Managed Care Organization, for Wake, Durham, Johnston, and Cumberland counties. And so we serve individuals who have Medicaid for their mental health, intellectual developmental disability, and substance use disorder needs. We also serve individuals who are uninsured as well in our communities. And so our funding is local, and it's also state and federal. And so on this slide, you'll see the Hope for North Carolina grant. That's a FEMA grant that we are managing right now, which offers crisis counseling. And so anyone in any of our communities can call that number and get support and resources as needed. And I also have at the bottom of the screen our 24-hour access and information line, and that's for Alliance. And that's 365 days a year for anyone who's having a crisis, is looking for resources, or who is looking to be connected to services. All right. Thank you, Janine. You reminded me about a certificate. Okay. We are beginning to have these trainings weekly. And so what we're going to do, instead of having you email us if you would like a certificate, if you logged on with your email, what will happen is we will get a list after the training session today, and it will probably take a little while to populate. However, I'll get a list of everyone that attended today and what your email addresses are. And what I'm going to do is send a generic training certificate for today with the title, and it was 1 hour, and then you can print it and write your name on it. And that's how we will be following up with all of our subsequent trainings that are coming up in the following weeks. It just seems like an easier way to do things. So if you have any questions, I will gladly put my email address in the chat box in the end, and you're welcome to email me any questions. Or you can hang around at the end. That's fine too. All right. So what I want you to do in the chat box is I'm going to ask you if something is a myth or a fact. And I want you to tell me if you think it is which one of those. So the first one is asking a person about their suicidal intent will only put the idea in their heads to kill themselves. Myth or fact? Excellent. Yes, y'all are great. It is a myth. Typically, when we ask someone about their suicidal thoughts or feelings, it really almost lifts the anxiety or the stress from them, and they're more willing to be open and honest with us. Nice. Next, once a person has a suicidal episode, they will always be suicidal. Myth or fact? Excellent. Yes, it is a myth. Most individuals who feel suicidal are only in that kind of period of distress for short amounts of time. All right, next. Once the suicidal event occurs and the person has gotten help, the risk and the concerns are over. Myth or fact? All right, y'all are good today. Yes, it is a myth. Yes, we have to continue to monitor people. Absolutely. Sometimes, months later, a person can have a recurrence or continue to consider an attempt. So we have to consider to monitor, Next, it's important to ask the person directly and clearly about their suicidal thoughts and intent. Fact or myth? Yes, y'all are great. Yes, that That's actually a fact. We want to be very clear and direct in how we ask. And a little later in the slideshow, we're going to talk about how do we ask someone that difficult question. Next, suicide happens with no warning. Myth or fact? This is a tricky one. This is a mixed bag. Yep. When I teach mental health first aid, their research says it is a myth that people always show warning signs. But the other side of the coin is, if we are not trained or well-versed in all of the signs and symptoms, it could be really, really easy to miss someone's signs and symptoms. So I think that one's kind of on the fence. All right, next. Everyone who dies by suicide is mentally ill. Myth or fact? Excellent. Yes, that is a myth. Only around half of individuals who die by suicide are mentally ill. And we'll talk more about that also later in the presentation. So last one, people who threaten suicide are just out to get some attention. Myth or fact? All right. I saw a couple of facts in there, but mostly myths. It is a myth. If someone is threatening suicide or even any kind of self-injurious behavior, it's not that they're attention seeking, but they are in desperate need of some kind of help and attention. That is a cry for help. Absolutely. And I've met a lot of families over the years who do not take suicide threats seriously, but we have to take everyone seriously. We really do. Whether they are passively suicidal or actively suicidal, we have to take that very seriously. All right. So, in the chat box, tell me, why don't we talk about suicide? Taboo, fear. Taboo, yes. Absolutely. Stigma plays an enormous role. Absolutely. I feel like people who are experiencing suicidal thoughts are scared to trust anyone because people with trauma histories are petrified to go to the hospital. Or I've known families who threaten the hospital on their family members quite often. If something's not okay and things aren't going well, then we'll threaten. Trust is a huge factor, but stigma is enormous. People are scared to ask the question because they don't know what to do. They don't know how to help get help. And for a lot of people who are feeling suicidal, they may not have anyone they trust. And I also think culture plays a big part in this as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And yes, it is a subject that has a lot of connotations tied to it. Absolutely. So demographics. Rates for suicide rise by age. White males that are older die most often by suicide. And there are so many reasons behind that. It could be, lack of purpose after retirement. It could be financial loss. It could be a divorce. It could be a chronic health condition. So many risk factors tied to that demographic. Men die by suicide more often than females because they use more lethal means. Men often use guns, sometimes hanging. Women are more likely to use prescription medications. Does anybody know why? Anybody want to guess? I'm looking for chat to pop up. All right, I'll tell you. Okay, the psychologist with the Raleigh Police Department said that she's learned in her studies that it is because of vanity. Women also don't want to leave a mess. So on average, there are 129 suicides per day in our country. North Carolina has a slightly higher rate than the US per 100,000 people. And I'll show you that on a slide in a couple of minutes. So when it comes to demographics, availability to guns, especially guns that are not kept locked up safe, there's an increased risk of suicidal death. It's the 10th leading cause of death in our country. In 2017, there were, 1.4 million suicide attempts. That's a lot of attempts. And a person dies by suicide every 11 minutes. And veterans make up a 20% portion of our annual suicides. That is extremely high. I think the numbers they talk about is they're one every 22 minutes for our veterans. So in North Carolina, if you look at the national average of 14 people per 100,000, we are 14.26. Excuse me. We are 35th in the country for suicides. Montana is number 1. I think they have about 29 people per 100,000 for suicide rates. So they are far higher. And if you look at this slide where the dollar sign is, look at how expensive suicide costs. And I'm definitely a person who preaches prevention and education a lot. And we definitely would love to be able to invest in prevention and education and treatment so that we can pay now instead of paying later with lives. We definitely don't want to lose any of our citizens here. All righty. So, children and teens, we'll talk about them really quickly. Under age 10, the rate is extremely low, but not impossible. When I was teaching Garner Police Department, one of the officers talked about a call he was summoned to where a 5-year-old attempted suicide by shooting themselves in the stomach. Luckily, the child survived. It is rare, but it's not impossible. And, you know, even preschoolers, even infants can suffer from depression. There are studies from, many decades ago where a parent who is depressed can imprint that and cause depression in their newborn infants. So that connection and relationship are so crucial. 90% of children who attempt suicide do so at home, and 70% of the time their parents are home. So if we look at, there's something called the YRBS. It's an extensive questionnaire done every couple of years, and students report about their health behaviors: smoking, vaping, sexual behaviors, suicide, mental health, and things like that. And it found that 1 in 5 high school students have seriously considered suicide within that school year. And so there are 50 to 300 attempts for every completed suicide. So that is a lot of attempts. And there are a lot of things that maybe are labeled accidents in children and teens that are actually suicides. And one example of that would be a car accident where a youth was, going at a high speed, hit a tree, and there were no skid marks. That might be an indicator that that was a suicide and not an accident. So screening for mental health issues is essential. And it's also a slippery slope. We have to figure out where are the best settings to screen our youth. Is it at school? Is it at the pediatric practice? We want everyone to really have a connection to youth, but we definitely want them to have screenings. One thing for here, if you're not in Wake County, one thing I do know about Wake County is that you will not see our school-age suicides, any of our elementary, middle, or high school suicides. they will not be on the news. They will not be in print news or on our broadcast news. My understanding is that decades ago, I think that there was some contagion in a series of suicides, and so there was an agreement that our local media would not promote or publish information about that. Yes, if you will email me, I will gladly send you the PowerPoint. Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm glad to share. And just remind me in the end, and I will put my email address in the chat box, and you can write it down and get in touch with me, and I'm glad to share. Absolutely. All right. So moving on. We're going to talk about red flags, and we're going to also talk about biology, environment, cognition. When someone is depressed, our brain chemistry does change. For some people, there is heredity. You know, there's so many studies now in epigenetics when it comes to trauma imprinting on our DNA. And you know, sometimes our temperament, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, all sorts of mental disorders can be passed down generation to generation. Our environment can be, you know, stressful and can be a trigger. When we live in that fight or flight mode, where we're in our emotional, like that limbic system, where we're always ready to pounce or protect ourselves, that can trigger depression as well, and that could tie into suicide. For individuals who have a brain injury, there are a lot of mental health issues that come along with that. A lot of changes to personality, a lot of changes to ability to cope, absolutely. And so cognition, our thoughts and beliefs play a big role in, you know, not just depression and suicide, but all mental health issues, absolutely. So when we're talking about someone who's depressed and potentially suicidal, some of the red flags we want to just pay attention to. And I will tell you with teens, sometimes it's hard to waffle between what's normal and what's concerning. And so we just sometimes have to observe and ask more questions. Red flags are withdrawal. So if someone you know used to love gardening and going to book club, and they don't do any of those anymore, their garden is all weeds, and you haven't seen them in 3 months at book club, even virtual book club, check in on that person. Something might be going on, especially in this time where so many people feel so disconnected. Demonstrating anger, rage, extreme mood swings, and that can go either way. There are a lot of individuals who experience depression and maybe are struggling, not really sharing much, and maybe it's your coworker and you knew that some things were going on, but you didn't know, you know, if they were going to therapy or taking an antidepressant, or, you know, it really wasn't, you know, your business, but they come into work a few weeks later and all of a sudden they are in the best mood, happy, smiling, everything seems good. That actually is a red flag. And I will tell you a very quick story. My neighbor, he was an older gentleman, and his mother had lived with him for a long, long time. And she had just moved into a rehabilitation home because she had had several strokes. And so he was alone. And, you know, I knew that he had had some depressive episodes, but he was always so kind and so, you know, interactive. But it was during winter, or around February or March, about probably 8 or 9 years ago. And we got a knock on our door, and it was the police, and they were asking questions. And he had died by suicide in his home. And the strange thing in hindsight, and it did not occur to me, is that he had started coming recently to the neighborhood poker game with the guys. He was fixing up his yard. He was getting his affairs in order. And I ran into his sister at a resource fair. She's a physical therapist. And she had told me that when she found him, he had everything so methodically written out and planned. And so sometimes there is no warning. So sometimes that, you know, a person may be feeling better is actually a red flag that they're not, because they've just kind of resolved that they're going to follow through. All right. Trauma, unbearable pain, health issues, giving away to, you know, prized possessions, maybe an older adult giving away their jewelry or, you know, some of their favorite antiques and things like that can be a red flag. Now, one thing to remember is nothing is in a silo. Typically with any mental health issue, it always involves a cluster of symptoms and a cluster of behaviors. So just one thing is not all inclusive. So we remember that. All right, so more about the brain. When a person experiences depression, and I'm not going to read these to you, I'm not a neuroscientist, but these are some of the ways it affects our brain. You know, when we have vitamin deficiencies, that can trigger depression. If our limbic system is overactive, if our metabolism is off, you know, some folks who are experiencing maybe symptoms of diabetes or thyroid issues, a lot of those things can trigger depression. When we don't sleep, that is a huge player in how we function. When we do not get enough sleep over a point in time, we seem kind of out of it. You know, that can increase our anxiety. It can trigger depression. It can have a huge impact. In young children, children who don't sleep well can look like they have ADHD. All right, so hereditary risks. In the general population, 1 in 10, that there's a hereditary correlation. If you have a close relative who's died by suicide, you're at a 2 to 3 times greater risk. And a story tied to that is, I'm not sure if any of you have read about, heard about, or noticed the Semicolon Project, which came to be, I think, about 4 years ago or so. A young woman who lost her father to suicide. She was really struggling, and she would doodle a semicolon on her arm because that to her was a prompt to remind her that, you know, a semicolon at the end of a sentence reminds you to take a pause. For her, it meant her story wasn't over. And somehow on social media, it became a very viral thing. So there are a lot of folks who wear semicolon jewelry. They may have a semicolon tattoo. And so I never assume that the semicolon means the same thing to every person. It could be a memorial to someone. It could be their own experience. And so I know I was teaching at the Sheriff's Department for Mental Health First Aid, and one of the sheriff's staff, we were talking, me and my co-trainer were talking about the Semicolon Project, and he pulls up his sleeve and shows us his tattoo. And it was a safe space and very comfortable. And so we asked him what that meant to him. And so we can't assume it just means that's a person who's considered suicide. And so it could mean a lot of different things. So unfortunately, the young lady who started the Semicolon Project did die by suicide a couple of years ago, which is just such a tragedy. But she did start something really important. So in the event both parents die by suicide, you're 7 times at greater risk. There are genetic, you know, functioning issues. There have been family twin adoption studies. There are a lot of research out there about epigenetics and suicide running in families. Sometimes it runs in families because that is how you cope. You know, just like the young woman in the Semicolon Project. Sadly, they solved their problems by suicide. There are cultural factors we have to remember. A lot of folks wrote taboo in the chat box when it came to stigma. Culture and taboo go together. There are a lot of folks who, you know, in their culture, you don't seek mental health help. That's not okay. We don't go and see shrinks. We're not crazy. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about our feelings. We don't talk about things like that. There are other cultures where when you're struggling, you pray, and that needs to be the fix. And I've talked to groups before where we talk about how if someone has cancer, we want them to see an oncologist and we want them to pray. And so we really want to, flip the switch in how we look at mental health. Our brain is part of our body. And if we can look at mental health as truly a health condition, then hopefully we can, view people who are struggling a little bit differently. We talk about how, I enjoy a meme just like the next person. I think they're funny, but sometimes I get upset when I see memes, and it's about to be, I know we've had hurricanes it's been an active season, but typically September is usually when North Carolina has a threat. And I always see memes about how the weather is bipolar, the weather is schizophrenic. There is absolutely no way we would ever put a meme out there that would say that the weather was cancer, or that the weather was brain tumor, or the weather was another label. And so we have to look at how we view mental health and mental illness versus how we look at those health conditions. In some cultures, asking for help is a weakness. I know in some cultures, men have to have machismo or have to be strong and dominant. And they're not allowed to talk about their feelings. They're not allowed to cry. They're not allowed to process. And that's, detrimental. Absolutely. There's a lot of shame in some families. If your child had cancer, chances are your freezer would be full of casseroles, because folks from church may drop things by. There might be flowers or plants dropped off. Folks, have decided to pick up groceries or babysit and things like that. There's all this outreach when it comes to a lot of serious health disorders. But I've known families before who their child goes to college and they have their first psychotic break, and they have to be hospitalized for maybe 6 months, 9 months, a year, and no one knows. And to me, that is the ultimate definition of stigma. And sadly, no one's helping that person with groceries. No one's dropping by casseroles. And so there's that big difference. All right. Any questions so far? All right. Please ask one in the chat box if you have one. All right. So access to means. Method at hand makes a life and death difference. Again, cutting or poisoning by medication typically has about a 1 to 2% fatality. Firearms, 8 or 9 out of 10 are fatal. So access to means is crucial. And it's so important that firearms are locked and kept as safely away, especially from children, as possible. That's crucial. And if you know someone who has expressed any kind of red flags or experienced significant depression, and you're concerned about their suicidality, removing any means from their home is very important. Very important. So, feelings of suicide do wax and wane. Absolutely. There are some people who think about it. Maybe they start an attempt. Maybe they hold that gun to see how it feels in their hand, or they tie that knot in a rope to see how strong it is and stop. Some people, can change their minds on a whim. I heard a story of a woman who she revealed to her therapist in a session that at an agency that she was having thoughts of suicide. 911 was called and a CIT officer was requested. And if you don't know what a CIT officer is, that is a crisis intervention team trained officer. And we do have CIT programs in all 4 of our counties in our catchment area. And so these officers receive an additional 40 hours of training to de-escalate mental health crises. So when people are having a mental health emergency, they are able to come on scene and hopefully de-escalate the situation. But in this woman's case, when she reveals this, she took off and ran out of the office. And the officers were coming one way, but there was a median. And so they could not flip around. They had the description of her car. And, you know, in a second, with her feeling trapped and urgent, she could have chosen to, you know, drive off a bridge or, you know, cross lanes and get hit or something. And so just because someone may say they have a specific plan right now, it doesn't mean that they can't change that plan. So if you ask a person if they are having suicidal thoughts and they say no, observe their nonverbal behavior. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So pay attention to their body language. You know, are they shaking? Are they crying? Are they avoiding eye contact and things like that? That may be more telling to you than the word no. So more risk factors. Mental health issue is a risk factor for suicide. And again, 50 to 54% of individuals who die by suicide do not have a mental health issue. Substance use, addiction can play a part, history of trauma, impulsiveness, reckless behavior, and some of these can come on quickly. You know, maybe your neighbor's husband has always been a pretty low-key conservative guy, and all of a sudden he has taken up skydiving and gotten a motorcycle, and maybe engaging in some other thrill-seeking but high-risk behaviors. That may be a red flag if it's combined with some other factors. Loss of a relationship can be a trigger. Losing a job, and then this time right now, a lot of folks are really struggling. Being isolated, that applies to now as well. We talked about age and ethnicity, older white males, but in the past few years, I think in the past 20 years, suicides have gone up by 30% nationwide. But I know in the past couple of years, suicide numbers have gone up in every age group, every ethnicity, every demographic. So it does not specify. It is equal opportunity. So for a lot of folks, feeling trapped is a high risk factor. Let's say somebody, well, here's an example actually. The pediatric practice where I take my children a long time ago, the office manager, she was super nice, but come to find out, I read on WRAL, she was arrested because she had embezzled $1 million from the practice. So she was arrested, she stood trial, she was found guilty, and within a short time, probably within a year or so of her prison sentence, she hung herself. And so she felt trapped. Chronic pain, severe health issues, but the biggest risk factor for future suicidal potential behavior is a prior attempt. I think around 50% of individuals die by suicide have at least one prior attempt in their history. So that is a huge factor. So asking the question, we don't want to beat around the bush or be generic. We don't want to say, are you thinking of hurting yourself? Because that can mean a lot of different things. That can mean, are you going to engage in non-suicidal self-injury? Are you going to engage in, you know, high risk-taking behavior? And that could be mixing medicine with alcohol or something like that. We want to be very clear and direct. So we want to say, are you having thoughts of suicide, or have you had thoughts of killing yourself? We don't want to, it's for myself as a trainer, I have to rely on folks in the recovery community to advise me on the language to use that is most sensitive to the recovery community. And so I don't say commit suicide because suicide's not a crime. And I try also to not say complete suicide because it's not like a checklist. So I try to be as specific as possible. So having suicidal thoughts or having thoughts of killing yourself. So ask calmly, be as confident as possible, despite this is probably one of the hardest questions you could ask somebody, especially somebody you really care about. Ask that person privately in a quiet place. Ask with empathy, not judgment, because there are so many times that we're in that situation and we're with a trusted person and we ask that difficult question, and when they say yes, the first thing we want to do is let them know that we care, that we're worried, and that we want to help them get the help they need, however that looks. We do not want to judge them. We don't want to tell them they're selfish. We don't want to ask them, how could you ever do this to your family? Because in that moment of crisis, none of those things matter to that person. The true objective for a person who is actively suicidal is to die. So, most importantly, we do not want to leave that person alone. And if we can't be the person to stay with them, we need to call and find someone who can, whether that's another family member that can be there until help arrives. There's lots and lots of different resources, and we'll talk a little bit about those in a few minutes as well. So let the person be part of the planning. Give them a choice. If they reveal this very, very difficult decision or thought to you, include them. So ask them, would you rather me call mobile crisis, or would you like me to ride with you to crisis and assessment? Or would you like me to call 911 or a CIT officer? Ask them what they prefer. For some people who do have severe mental health issues and have a history of hospitalizations or other, visiting crisis facilities, they may have a preference. We don't want to make promises that we can't keep. We don't want to keep secrets, but we want to do our best. So in the event that someone says, I don't want to go to XYZ hospital, they were not nice to me last time I was there, the best thing that we can say to this person that we care about is, I'm going to call the CIT officer. I'm going to let them know, if at all possible, please do not take them to XYZ hospital. If possible, please go to ABC hospital. And so we really want that person to be part of that planning if they are capable of doing so. So what do? We want to listen first and foremost. And that means not fidgeting. That means not looking at our phone. We want to be as calm as possible, be as empathic as we can. We do not want to crowd someone. Sometimes to talk to somebody and sit next to them is so much more comfortable than sitting directly across from them and staring at them. And so a person may be more open to help when they're feeling more comfortable. So we want to be clear and direct. We want to be as compassionate as we can and offer support. And it's okay to, if someone has a question and we don't know the answer, to let them know, I don't know, but I'll try and find out. Absolutely. We want to do the best we can. And it's okay to be honest. So we're not expected to fix the situation. We do not have to go this alone. It's so important to have a base knowledge of resources to give the person, or to access to help the person, or to access anyone. We could be in public and somebody, you could be driving on the overpass and see someone up on the bridge. And if you know to call 911 and ask for a CIT officer, that's huge. All right. So when we're assessing suicide, there's a spectrum. There are some folks who have what's called passive suicidal ideation. You know, maybe they're preoccupied with death, or they've, thought about, I wonder what things would be like if I wasn't here. I wonder what would happen if I drove into traffic. I don't have a plan, and I don't plan on doing it, but I've just thought about it from time to time. And that person definitely needs a referral. We definitely want to connect that person to some help to explore why they're feeling that way. Active suicidal ideation, the person has really thought about, okay, I have 27 Xanax from my panic disorder. I wonder how many it will take, or how many do I have to hoard to be able to attempt suicide. That is really thinking about how you're going to do it. And we want to ask someone, if they say yes, they are thinking about suicide, we want to ask them, have they thought about how and when, and do they have the means? And for most people, they're, they may just say no, but I've just been thinking about it. Okay. But for those who have said, yeah, I have a gun, or I haven't been taking my Xanax, and I've thought about that. The anniversary of my divorce is coming up. That person is giving it a lot of thought. And so that's a significant risk, definitely. Some people with social media and texting and things like that, some people will post about it. And if you have a family member that's across the country and they are posting some things that are highly concerning, screenshot it, because they may delete it later. And we always have the ability to reach out to that local police department and ask them to do a welfare check. They are glad to do those things. Absolutely. Another example might be, so a friend of mine whose son, he was in middle school, and his girlfriend that he broke up with was having some struggles, and she texted a picture of a bowl of pills to this young man and said, look what you're going to make me do. And he knew to go to his parents. And so the parents contacted staff at school that they knew in order to get in touch with the principal and to get that young lady the help that she needed. And luckily, this young man knew what to do. So having an idea or plan and some resources is always good. And, in my opinion, I think, a person with moderate and high risk, both should not be left alone and need immediate assistance. Absolutely. And one thing I will say is, if you've never heard of Kevin Hines, he is he's in his 30s now, but he is one of I think 30 or 40 people who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and survived. And he talks about his story. He was 19 years old, and he had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder with psychotic features. And he was really struggling. And he had not slept for days. And he was in active suicidal ideation. The voices were telling him he needed to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. And he lived not far from there. So he gets on a bus. And there were so many kind of touch points from the time he left the house and talked to his father to the time he jumped off the bridge that regular folks could have asked to help him. His father knew something was wrong, but did not ask the question. And Kevin Hines has said in some of his videos on YouTube that he wanted his father to ask him, are you thinking about suicide? And his dad asked every other question but that direct question. And so Kevin hops on the bus and he's headed to San Francisco, and he's sobbing. He is visibly distraught. No one asks him if he's okay. So he arrives at the bridge, and the bus driver, who sees that he's visibly distraught, doesn't ask him if he needs help or if he's okay. He just yells at him to get off the bus. And so that's another missed opportunity. So Kevin approaches the bridge, and a lady stops him and says, "Can you take my picture?" She had to see that he was visibly shaken. She did not ask him if he was okay. So that was another miss. Thank you, Deneen. So what was unfortunate is, in hindsight, he did jump. He did survive. One thing that Kevin does talk about is that he is not suicidal every day, but he thinks about suicide daily, but he's not actively suicidal. So if you want to look him up, he has great videos on YouTube. He's written books, and there are documentaries that he's done as well. So these are some of the signs of an elevated risk. Hopelessness, helplessness. So, talking about how no one cares, not sleeping, increased anxiety, not caring anymore. If someone's actively psychotic, they are at a risk. If someone's having command hallucinations, telling them to hurt themselves. If folks are seeking means and actively talking about death and suicide, these are the most obvious red flags. So who do we call in a crisis? National Suicide Hotline. If someone is a veteran, they can choose one and be connected to a veteran to help them. There's the crisis text line of 741-741. You can also call Alliance Help 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The situation will be triaged. Mobile crisis may be sent out. A CIT officer may be sent out. It can look a lot of different ways, but they will triage the level of the crisis going on. Hope Line is another resource. You can always call 911 if you're unsure. And then eventually, I think Congress has approved the 988 number. I don't think it's active yet, but that is a future effort that is coming into play. So what's an involuntary commitment? That is something that the magistrate does. We have to go, a family member, anyone can seek a petition for an involuntary commitment to occur. And that means that your loved one, there is enough evidence of them being a harm to themselves and or others that they will legally be hospitalized and held for a certain amount of time. So other resources to access in the community: Alliance, our free trainings that we're offering weekly. Locally, we have the Wake Network of Care, we have the Durham Network of Care, the Hope for North Carolina line. NAMI has amazing support groups and education, mental health first aid classes. Oh, no. Oh, Deneen, I'm sorry. No, it's a 1 hour. Triangle Survivors of Suicide is another one. That is another support group. They have a walk every year, and they do excellent work in our community. And then the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention is also, that's a national resource. So there are so many ways that individuals can get help, but also those who love them. A lot of folks who are struggling seek NAMI to help just learn, some of their NAMI 101 classes are excellent. And these are free resources that we can access in the community. So remember, anybody can be at risk for suicide. Every threat we have to take seriously. We have to listen. We have to ask the hard question and then help people get the help they need. And really what's at the root of all of it is offering somebody hope for recovery. Absolutely. And also, if you're in the helping profession, taking care of ourselves is just as is crucial, especially if we have a loved one who's struggling. We have to take care of ourselves. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And then if we want to come back, and if you guys want to unmute and ask me any questions, we've got, this was a 1 hour training. So we have about 10 minutes left. If anybody wants to ask any questions. I will send my, thank you so much. I'm going to send my email. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I did forget. Nope. Oh, Kevin Hines, Hines. And if you're even more fascinated There is also an officer name. Oh boy, he's a Kevin also. Oh, I forgot his last name, but he was a patrol officer who actually was the motorcycle patrol officer on the Golden Gate Bridge. He was off work the day that Kevin Hines jumped, and he had a lot of guilt related to that, but his story is amazing also. So if you guys want a copy of the PowerPoint, please email me. I put my email address in there, but if you have a question, please unmute yourself and ask anything you'd like, and I'll try to answer it.
I want to add, Wendy, that Kevin
Yes.
Hines, you can actually follow him on Twitter, but if you follow him, you can see where he does tours. He talks about, he tells his stories across the country. He's actually come he's been in North Carolina.
He's been here a lot.
In Greensboro,
Yeah.
in different colleges.
Yes,
and
I think he was even here
awesome.
twice, maybe last year or the year before. It is
yeah.
what I walked into a training and did not know he was going to be speaking, and I was bawling. People were texting me saying, "Are you okay?" And it was just that powerful. Just, it was overwhelming. It was so powerful.
I've seen it too. It's very powerful. I would encourage
Yes.
anyone you get a chance to definitely go hear his
Yes,
story.
I would highly recommend it. Any other questions? I'm going to stay till 12. It's not, sorry, till 1:30 in case anything pops up, or if anybody wants to hang back and ask any questions. I'm glad to do so. You are very welcome to Fayetteville. I'm so happy that we're offering these to all 4 counties now instead of just our county. So I've gotten to meet other people, which is great. Oh, awesome. At Kevin Hines' story. Thank you, Deneen. Oh, somebody's already emailed me. Great. That's great. Excellent. You know what I forgot to put? Deneen, I forgot to tell them that this will be on YouTube also.
Oh yeah, it is.
Totally
Correct.
forgot. So
well, you have about 31 people that you can tell.
Hi, everybody. This is being recorded and it will be on YouTube probably in the next 48 hours. So if anybody else wants to go and watch that, that's perfectly fine. Alliance has a YouTube channel that has all of our trainings. All right, I'm going to turn off record.